If someone told you the most dangerous decision a mother could make in wartime was not running, hiding, or fighting, but trusting the wrong person, would you believe them? What if the one man she had been taught to fear carried the only chance her child had left? And what if everything she believed about the enemy had been carefully built on stories that were about to collapse in a single afternoon? Before this day ended, one frightened choice would save a little boy, challenge the conscience of an American officer, and leave a memory that neither family would ever forget. But none of them knew that yet. At that moment, there was only fear and a decision that could never be taken back. Germany, late April 1945. The war was collapsing one town at a time. But for ordinary families, the fighting had been replaced by something quieter and, in many ways, just as frightening. Food had almost disappeared. Homes stood abandoned. Roads filled with exhausted civilians carrying everything they still owned in blankets, wooden carts, or worn leather suitcases. Among them walked Anna Keller, a 32-year-old widow whose entire world now fit inside the tiny hand of her 6-year-old son, Lucas. She had once lived in a modest brick house where fresh bread cooled on the kitchen windowsill every Sunday morning, and her son's laughter drifted across a garden filled with apple blossoms. Those memories already felt like they belonged to someone else. Now, every sunrise began with the same silent calculation. How far could a hungry child walk before his legs refused to move? How long could a mother pretend everything would be all right when she no longer believed it herself? Lucas had stopped asking when they would go home. Children understood more than adults often imagined. Instead, he simply squeezed his mother's hand whenever distant engines echoed across the countryside. Anna always tightened her grip. She had spent years hearing speeches, rumors, whispered warnings, and official announcements describing what American soldiers would do if they ever reached German villages. Those words had settled deep inside her mind until they felt less like propaganda and more like instinct. Never let them find your child. Never trust their smiles. Never believe their promises. Those lessons followed her with every step as she led Lucas along a narrow country road lined with shattered fences and fields just beginning to turn green beneath the first warm days of spring. Nature seemed determined to continue, even while human certainty disappeared. Somewhere ahead lay an American checkpoint. Somewhere behind them was a past that no longer existed. And somewhere between those two worlds, a frightened mother was about to discover that the hardest battle she would ever fight was not against an army, but against everything she believed she already knew. The road narrowed until it disappeared into a stretch of muddy wagon tracks bordered by abandoned farms. Empty chicken coops stood with their doors swinging gently in the wind. A broken water pump creaked with every breeze, sounding almost like someone calling for help. Anna stopped beside an old stone well and lowered the small canvas bag from her shoulder. She counted what remained without taking anything out. One small piece of dark bread, half of a dried potato, nothing else. She looked toward Lucas before allowing herself to sigh. The little boy sat quietly on a fallen fence rail, his boots dangling several inches above the ground. His cheeks had become thinner during the past weeks, yet he still managed a tired smile whenever he caught his mother watching him. It was a smile meant to comfort her, and somehow that hurt even more. She broke the last piece of bread exactly in half and handed him the larger portion. Lucas looked at both pieces before pushing one back toward her. "You have to eat too, Mama," he whispered. Anna smiled softly, pretending she had already eaten earlier that morning. Mothers had been telling that same harmless lie for generations. Lucas hesitated, then accepted the bread, chewing slowly as though making it last could somehow create more of it. A few minutes later, he reached for his mother's hand again, but this time his fingers felt unusually warm. Anna knelt beside him and pressed the back of her hand gently against his forehead. The warmth was unmistakable. His breathing remained calm, but his face had lost what little color it still carried. Fear settled into her chest without making a sound. A hungry child could still keep walking. A child with a fever might not. She looked across the empty fields, searching for anything that suggested life. Smoke rose in the distance from a farmhouse chimney. Somewhere beyond the rolling hills, she also heard the low rumble of truck engines. American vehicles. The sound drifted through the spring air, steady and organized, growing slightly louder with every passing minute. Anna closed her eyes for only a second. Everything she had ever been told urged her to turn away, disappear into the woods, and keep running until darkness covered the roads again. Yet another voice, quieter but impossible to ignore, reminded her that no amount of fear could lower a fever or fill an empty stomach. She lifted Lucas into her arms for a moment before setting him gently back on his feet. The effort left her breathing harder than she expected. Her son leaned against her shoulder without complaining. Children often revealed the seriousness of their condition not by crying, but by becoming unusually silent. Anna stared toward the distant road where the engines continued their slow approach. Somewhere beyond the next hill stood the people she had spent years believing she should never face. Somewhere behind her lay only empty villages and shrinking hope. For the first time since leaving home, she realized that continuing forward and turning back had become the very same choice. Anna remained still until the engines became more than distant echoes. Soon the first olive-drab truck appeared over the gentle rise, followed by another, and then a jeep moving several yards ahead of the convoy. Dust drifted behind the tires, glowing softly beneath the afternoon sun. The vehicles did not race forward. They moved with the measured confidence of men who had spent too many months traveling uncertain roads. Lucas lifted his head from his mother's shoulder and watched in silence. His small fingers tightened around her hand. Anna could feel her own heartbeat growing louder than the engines themselves. Every warning she had ever heard returned at once. Hide. Stay invisible. Never let them see your child. Yet there was nowhere left to disappear. The open field stretched for hundreds of yards in every direction, interrupted only by weathered fences and scattered trees that offered little cover. Running would accomplish nothing except exhausting Lucas even further. The lead jeep slowed before reaching them. An American officer stepped onto the road, adjusting the strap across his shoulder before removing his field cap for a moment to wipe the sweat from his forehead. He appeared to be in his middle 30s, with sunburned skin that hinted at long days outdoors rather than behind a desk. His name was Captain James Walker, a school principal from Ohio before the war had interrupted an ordinary life filled with classrooms, baseball games, and family dinners. He noticed the child before he truly looked at the woman. Lucas leaned heavily against his mother, his eyelids struggling to remain open. James raised one hand, not as a command, but as a quiet greeting. He stopped nearly 20 feet away, leaving enough distance that neither mother nor child would feel surrounded. Behind him, two soldiers waited beside the jeep without lifting their rifles or speaking. The only sounds were birds somewhere across the fields and the soft ticking of an engine cooling in the spring air. Anna studied every movement, expecting the moment when kindness would disappear and fear would prove justified. Instead, James slowly removed the canteen hanging from his belt. He took a long drink himself before tightening the cap again. Then, with deliberate care, he placed the canteen on the ground several feet in front of him and stepped backward. He said nothing for several seconds, allowing the gesture to speak before the words followed. Finally, in slow and careful German, learned from a phrase booklet carried throughout Europe, he managed only a simple sentence. The water is safe. His accent was unmistakably American, and the grammar was imperfect, yet the meaning reached Anna immediately. She looked from the canteen to the officer and back again. For the first time since the war had entered her life, the picture she had carried in her mind of the enemy no longer matched the man standing quietly before her. Anna did not move immediately. Her eyes remained fixed on the canteen, resting in the grass, as though it might conceal something she could not yet understand. The silence stretched across the empty road, carried only by a light breeze that stirred the fresh leaves overhead. Lucas looked up at his mother with tired eyes. "Mama, I am thirsty," he whispered so softly that she almost wished she had not heard him. Those 4 words weighed more heavily than every warning she had carried for years. She took one cautious step forward, then another, never allowing her gaze to leave Captain James Walker. He remained exactly where he was, his hands visible at his sides, making no attempt to shorten the distance between them. Anna finally reached the canteen. She hesitated once more before unscrewing the cap. The faint smell of clean water rose into the cool spring air. She remembered watching the officer drink from it only moments earlier. Slowly, she lifted it to Lucas. The little boy drank carefully at first, then eagerly, stopping only when he needed to catch his breath. Color seemed to return to his face almost immediately, if only by a small measure. Anna took a single sip herself before replacing the cap with trembling fingers. When she looked back up, Captain Walker offered nothing more than a quiet nod. There was no smile of triumph, no expectation of gratitude. It was simply an acknowledgement that a frightened child no longer had to endure another hour of thirst. Then James reached into the canvas satchel hanging from the jeep. He removed a neatly wrapped field ration and held it in one hand. Once again, he did not approach. He walked halfway toward them, knelt, placed the package on an old tree stump beside the road, and stepped back. One of the younger American soldiers watched with visible curiosity but said nothing. James understood that trust could not be demanded. It had to be given room to grow. Anna stared at the package. She had imagined countless meetings with American soldiers over the years. Every version had ended with fear. None had included a man quietly setting food within reach before retreating as though he wished to protect her dignity as much as her safety. She carefully opened the wrapping. Crackers, a small chocolate bar, processed cheese, powdered drink mix, ordinary military supplies to the men who carried them. Yet to Anna, they looked almost unreal after weeks of uncertainty. She broke the crackers into smaller pieces and handed every one to Lucas before taking anything herself. James noticed the gesture without saying a word. He recognized it instantly. Thousands of miles from his home in Ohio, it reminded him of his own mother during the hardest years of the Great Depression, always insisting she was full while quietly making certain her children never left the table hungry. In that simple moment, neither of them saw an enemy. They saw only what every war struggled to erase, but never completely could: a parent trying to protect a child. Captain James Walker glanced toward the convoy before speaking quietly with one of his sergeants. Their conversation lasted less than a minute, carried out in calm voices that Anna could not understand. Yet there was no urgency in their movements and no sign that anyone intended to force a decision upon her. When James returned, he spoke slowly, choosing each German word with visible care. Medical station, 2 miles ahead. Doctor, warm food, safe place for your son. His pronunciation was imperfect, but the concern behind the words needed no translation. Anna looked down at Lucas. The little boy had finished the last bite of the crackers and was leaning against her side, fighting to keep his eyes open. His fever had not broken. She knew that if she continued walking alone through abandoned countryside, hope would fade with every mile. She also knew that accepting help required crossing a line she had promised herself she would never cross. James seemed to understand the conflict written across her face. He did not repeat the offer. He simply waited. That quiet patience surprised her almost as much as the kindness itself. Finally, Anna gave the smallest nod. James answered with one of his own before turning to his men. Instead of placing Anna and Lucas inside a military truck, he asked the driver of the Jeep to clear the front passenger seat. He wanted the child to ride where the journey would be smoother. Lucas looked uncertain until James removed his own folded field jacket and spread it across the seat cushion to make it softer. The gesture was so ordinary that it felt strangely powerful. Within minutes, the convoy resumed its slow journey along the country road. No one questioned Anna. No one demanded documents or explanations. The soldiers focused on repairing damaged fences as they passed, helping an elderly farmer push a broken cart out of deep mud, and waving to frightened children watching cautiously from distant windows. Anna found herself observing every small detail with growing confusion. These scenes did not resemble the stories that had filled her imagination for so many years. One young soldier offered Lucas a stick of chewing gum with an awkward smile before quickly looking away, embarrassed by his own shyness. Another removed his helmet for a moment to greet an elderly woman standing outside a weathered farmhouse. None of it seemed staged. None of it appeared designed to impress anyone. It simply felt natural. James drove without unnecessary conversation, keeping both hands lightly on the steering wheel while occasionally glancing toward Lucas to make sure the little boy remained comfortable. Anna noticed something she had not expected. He never stared at her with suspicion, curiosity, or victory. He treated her exactly as he would have treated any frightened mother carrying too much worry for one person alone. As the afternoon sunlight stretched across the fields, the distance between two former enemies was no longer measured in miles. It was measured in quiet acts of respect that asked for nothing in return. The medical station occupied what had once been a small village schoolhouse. The playground still stood behind the building, its wooden swing moving gently in the evening breeze as though children might return at any moment. The sounds inside were quiet instead of hurried. Soft footsteps crossed old wooden floors. Enamel cups touched tables with a light clink. Somewhere nearby, someone stirred a pot of hot soup, and for the first time in weeks the comforting smell of cooked vegetables drifted through the air. A military doctor examined Lucas with calm efficiency before placing a cool cloth across the boy's forehead. After listening to his breathing and checking his temperature, he smiled reassuringly at Anna. He is exhausted, dehydrated, and running a fever, but I believe he will recover with rest, water, and regular meals. Anna closed her eyes for a brief moment. She had not realized how tightly she had been holding her breath until hope finally gave her permission to let it go. Lucas soon fell asleep on a neatly made cot, wrapped beneath a clean wool blanket that looked far too generous for such uncertain times. Anna remained seated beside him, gently brushing a loose strand of hair away from his forehead. Outside the open window, she watched the American soldiers continue their work. No one celebrated victory. No one behaved like conquerors. One group repaired broken desks inside a classroom so local children could someday return. Another helped an elderly woman carry firewood to her front porch before quietly continuing on their way. A young private carefully handed a warm bowl of soup to a little German girl standing beside her grandfather, smiling only after making certain she received the first spoonful. Captain James Walker moved among his men without raising his voice. He thanked them more often than he corrected them, and whenever supplies arrived, he always seemed to ensure the civilians were served before he accepted anything for himself. As evening settled over the village, one of the soldiers offered James a fresh cup of hot coffee. He accepted it, held the steaming cup for a second, then noticed an elderly German man sitting alone beneath a tree with trembling hands. Without hesitation, James walked over and placed the coffee into the old man's hands before returning without another word. He never looked around to see whether anyone had noticed. Anna did. She had spent years believing kindness always arrived with conditions attached. Yet everything she had witnessed since stepping onto that lonely country road suggested something entirely different. These gestures were small enough to be overlooked, but together they formed a truth that no speech could have conveyed. As the golden light of sunset spilled across the schoolyard, Anna realized that her fear had not disappeared all at once. It had quietly begun giving way to something far more unfamiliar. Respect had entered where certainty once lived, and with it came the unsettling possibility that the story she had trusted for so long had never revealed the whole picture. Lucas slept through the night without waking once. By morning the fever had begun to fade, and a little color had returned to his cheeks. The doctor smiled as he packed away his instruments. Another day or two, and he should be chasing birds instead of blankets, he said warmly. For the first time in many weeks, Anna allowed herself a quiet smile that reached her eyes. Relief, however, lasted only until she overheard a conversation outside the schoolhouse. Captain James Walker and several engineers were studying a worn map spread across the hood of a Jeep. Their voices remained calm, but one sentence caught Anna's attention immediately. They planned to reopen the old Eastern Road before sunset so medical supplies could reach neighboring villages. Anna felt her heartbeat slow, for an entirely different reason. She knew that road. Before the fighting had swept through the region, her late husband had delivered grain to farms beyond the hills every autumn. She remembered an abandoned stone bridge, and just beyond it, a meadow where warning signs had once been placed after explosives were buried months earlier. During the confusion of the final weeks of the war, many of those markers had disappeared. The danger had not. She stood frozen beside the open window, her hands tightening around the edge of the wooden frame. If the convoy followed the route shown on that map, they would unknowingly enter an area no careful traveler would choose. She told herself that remaining silent would be understandable. These men wore different uniforms. Yesterday, she would have considered them enemies without hesitation. Yet every memory from the past 24 hours refused to let that thought remain simple. She remembered the cool water placed on the ground instead of forced into her hands. She remembered the field ration left within reach, the jacket folded beneath Lucas, the doctor who treated her son without asking questions, and the quiet cup of coffee that James had given to an elderly stranger without expecting thanks. Those moments returned one after another until they outweighed years of fear. Anna looked toward the room where Lucas still slept peacefully beneath the clean blanket. One day her son would ask what kind of person his mother had chosen to become when everything around her was uncertain. The answer could not be built upon silence. She stepped outside into the fresh morning air. Dew still covered the grass, sparkling beneath the first rays of sunlight. Captain Walker looked up from the map as she approached. Before she spoke, she noticed several soldiers glance toward her with quiet curiosity. Taking a steady breath, Anna pointed toward the winding road marked on the paper. Then, in a calm voice that surprised even herself, she said, "Please do not take that road. I believe it is still dangerous, and I can show you a safer way." For a brief moment, no one spoke. A young sergeant looked from the map to Anna with visible uncertainty. "Captain, we cannot verify that information," he said quietly. "It could be wrong." James did not answer immediately. Instead, he studied Anna's face with the same calm attention he had shown on the country road. He had spent enough years working with people before the war to recognize the difference between fear, deception, and sincerity. What he saw now was neither panic nor calculation. It was the expression of a mother making a difficult choice because she believed remaining silent would be harder to live with. James folded the map carefully. "Then we will verify it," he replied. Turning back to Anna, he asked in slow German, "Can you show us?" She nodded once. Less than an hour later, a small group set out along the narrow lane, walking instead of driving. Anna led the way at an unhurried pace, following landmarks she remembered from peaceful harvest seasons years earlier. An old oak tree leaned over the path exactly as it always had. A weathered stone bridge crossed a shallow stream where children had once skipped rocks during summer afternoons. Beyond it stretched the meadow she had never forgotten. She raised one hand, signaling everyone to stop. "Do not go farther," she said softly. The warning posts used to stand here. The engineers moved ahead with deliberate caution, examining the ground inch by inch. Several tense minutes passed in complete silence, except for birds singing in the trees overhead and the gentle sound of water flowing beneath the bridge. Finally, one engineer looked back toward Captain Walker and gave a firm nod. Beneath the overgrown grass, they had discovered clear evidence that the area remained unsafe to cross without proper clearance. The convoy changed its route immediately, avoiding the meadow entirely and following a longer road that curved through nearby farmland. As the last truck disappeared safely beyond the hills, the young sergeant who had questioned Anna removed his cap and approached her with quiet humility. "Thank you," he said simply. James stepped beside him, his eyes resting for a moment on the peaceful landscape before turning toward Anna. "Today," he said with genuine gratitude, "you protected every person traveling with us." Anna looked toward the schoolhouse where Lucas was resting by the open window, the morning sunlight warming his face. A gentle smile crossed her lips. "You protected my son first," she answered. Neither of them said another word. They did not need to. Between them stood no speeches, no celebrations, and no victory. There remained only a quiet understanding that trust, once offered with honesty, had returned carrying something even greater than safety. It had restored a measure of humanity that war had tried, but failed, to take away. Years passed, and the spring when everything changed slowly became a memory, carried more in quiet conversations than in official records. The schoolhouse returned to being a place of learning. The broken fences were replaced. Apple trees blossomed again beside roads that no longer echoed with military convoys. Children who had once hidden behind curtains eventually raced across open fields without fear. Among them was Lucas Keller. He grew into a thoughtful young man whose childhood illness became little more than a fading scar upon his memory. Yet he never forgot the faces of the people who had appeared when his mother believed hope had almost disappeared. Inspired by the doctor who had cared for him without asking where he came from, Lucas chose to study medicine. He often said that healing someone should never begin by asking which side they once stood on. Patients arrived at his small clinic from neighboring towns, carrying different histories, different beliefs, and different accents. Every one of them received the same careful attention. Hanging on the wall behind his desk was a simple black and white photograph taken many years earlier. It showed a dusty country road, a tired little boy wrapped in an oversized military jacket, and an American officer standing several feet away with a quiet expression that revealed neither pride nor victory. Visitors occasionally asked whether the man in the picture was a relative. Lucas always smiled before answering. No, he would say, he was the stranger who reminded my mother that compassion can survive even when the world forgets how to trust. Anna lived long enough to watch her grandchildren play beneath the same apple trees that had once seemed destined never to bloom again. She rarely spoke about the war itself. Instead, she spoke about choices. She believed history was often remembered through battles, while ordinary lives were changed by moments so small they could easily be overlooked. A cup of water placed gently on the ground. A warm jacket folded beneath a sick child. A meal offered without expectation. A decision to listen instead of assuming the worst. Those were the moments she wanted future generations to remember. Somewhere across the Atlantic, Captain James Walker eventually returned to Ohio and resumed the life that war had interrupted. He never considered himself extraordinary. When asked about his service, he usually changed the subject toward the teachers, doctors, farmers, and parents he had met along the way, believing they had shown greater courage than he ever could. It is often said that history is shaped by generals and governments, but sometimes its quietest victories begin with two ordinary people willing to see each other as human before anything else. On that forgotten country road, no speeches ended a conflict, and no celebration marked the moment. There is only a mother who chose trust over fear, an officer who answered trust with respect, and a little boy whose future became living proof that kindness given without conditions can outlive even the darkest chapters of history. She never raised her voice. She simply raised the standard by which another human being could be seen.